Music. Lovely people, this is your commander talking. We truly want to believe that you had a charming flight. We are currently drawing nearer San Francisco Worldwide Air Terminal and will land in around 30 minutes. Around 11:30 a.m. nearby time. The current climate in San Francisco is clear with a temperature of 17 C. We thank you for flying Asiana carriers and individual from Star Collusion partake in your visit in San Francisco, and we desire to see you once more. Before long, Asiana carrier's flight to 14 is on. The last methodology after a long excursion from South Korea. On board 307 individuals are expecting a smooth arrival at one of the most active air terminals in the assembled states. The weather conditions is awesome and perceivability is clear. However, at the times to come, the group will confront surprising difficulties, will test their abilities and decision-making. This is the account of Asiana Aircraft's Flight 214 on the morning of July 6, 2013. Asiana carrier's flight to 114A Boeing Tri-7 was approaching San Francisco Global Air Terminal. The Boeing Tri-7 is known as one of the most secure and most solid planes in business flight, and Asiana carriers had major areas of strength for a record up to this point. On board, the climate was quiet as travelers got comfortable for the last snapshots of their venture. A few peered out the windows, partaking free skies and delightful seas as the plane started its drop. A team of 4 pilots worked this
flight. Skipper Lee Cook, who was in preparing on the Boeing Tri-7, had 9,700 flight hours, however just 43 hours on this airplane type. He was the pilot flying for this trip with first official Lee Jong-min as his teacher. Also, pilot observing he had more than 12,000 flight hours and was liable for directing the methodology and handling a help commander and alleviation. First official were likewise essential for the group. They took control during the voyage stage. This pivoting framework is standard on long stretch trips to guarantee the group is very much rested before the basic approach and landing stages for the flight group. It seemed like the late evening as per their interior body timekeepers, as they were still lined up with South Korea time. This implied they were working when their bodies would commonly be very still, which probably impacted their readiness. Also, decision-making. In spite of this, after roughly 10 long periods of flight, the plane was cleared for a straight-in visual way to deal with runway 28 remaining at San Francisco Worldwide Air Terminal. The climate conditions were ideal for a visual move toward. Winds were light and perceivability was 10 mi. Runway 28 remaining at San Francisco Global Air Terminal measures 11,381 ft long and 200 ft wide. With its extended length, it is appropriate for dealing with huge airplane like the Boeing Tri-7. The air terminal is furnished with an instrument landing framework and accuracy radio route framework that gives short reach direction to airplane during their way to deal with a runway, particularly in unfortunate climate or low perceivability. The ILS works through two kinds of radio transmissions: the localizer and the float slant. The localizer helps the pilots or the autopilot keep the airplane lined up with the runway community line. It demonstrates whether the plane is excessively far to one side or then again right, and helps guide it back onto the right way. The coast slant helps the pilots control the airplane's drop point, ensuring it follows the right incline down to the runway. It demonstrates whether the plane is excessively high or excessively coming up short on the, however, move toward on this specific day. The skim slant for runway 28 remaining was unavailable, adding intricacy to the approach. Without robot IZ direction for their drop point, the group needed to physically control the plane's plummet to remain on the right skimway while the coast slant was inaccessible. The localizer stayed functional, giving sidelong direction for the moved toward the paid accomplice of the present. Skipper Lee Kang-Suk, who was the pilot flying, had restricted insight with the Boeing Tri-7 and had never physically set down this sort of airplane without the help of the ILS. This was his first time endeavoring a visual methodology at San Francisco Worldwide Air Terminal, in spite of the fact that he felt dubious and uncomfortable with the circumstance. He remained quiet about his interests. Social elements where respect to power is normal probably impacted this choice. In the various leveled climate of the cockpit, he could have delayed to express uncertainty before the more experienced teacher pilot at 11:12 nearby time, 15 minutes prior to handling the alleviation. First official gotten back to the cockpit and took his seat in the leap seat behind the skipper. Also, first official. By this point the team had previously finished the drop agenda as the flight went on toward its objective. The team was cleared to plunge to bring down elevations and directed to capture a straight-in way to deal with runway 28. Left 9 minutes after the fact. Approach control asked the flight team on the off chance that they had the air terminal in sight. First officially affirmed they did, and the air traffic regulator cleared them for a visual move toward the plane. Was plunging through 6,300 ft at a velocity of around 211 bunches with the folds and landing gear still up. The autopilot flight chief framework was in flight level change speed mode, which changes the plane's pitch to keep a chose velocity during drop, raising the nose to dial back, also bringing the nose down to increment speed. The auto choke was in hold mode. It was no longer to mean the framework changing motor push to control speed, leaving the motors at their current setting except if physically changed by the pilots. At 11:23 the plane caught the localizer as it plunged through 4,800 ft. The pilot flying Skipper Lee instructed folds 1 to be set, and the pilot checking affirmed speed. Really take a look at folds 1 set around 14 miles from the runway. Diving through 4,800 ft. Aviation Authority trained them to diminish their velocity to 180 hitches and keep up with that speed until 5 m. Out. The pilot flying changed the air speed appropriately and called for folds 5 speed. Actually take a look at folds 5 set while their activities were proper, leaving the autopilot in flight level change speed mode made. Dealing with the drop, really testing the autopilot changed the plane's pitch to keep up with the chose velocity, which implied that when the pilot flying decreased, if the autopilot raised the nose to slow the airplane to deal with the plummet more. Actually, the flight group could have conveyed the speed slows down, however picked not to. This choice made the plane float over the coastway, and at this point things began to turn out badly. The pilots didn't quickly see the airplane was at this point not on the right 3 floatway. Meanwhile, the plunge rate dropped to 300 ft each moment, far too low to even consider remaining on course, with the plane now around 11.2 nautical miles from the runway and diving through 4,300 ft. The pilot flying exchanged the autopilot pitch mode from flight level change speed to vertical speed mode, setting the drop rate to less 1,000 ft each moment. In flight level change speed mode, the autopilot changes the plunge to keep up with the chose velocity, yet in vertical speed mode the group physically chooses the pace of plummet. While this gave the pilots more command over the drop rate, it additionally required nearer thoughtfulness regarding velocity to stay away from issues with speed. The executives simultaneously the auto choke consequently changed from hold to SPD mode. In hold mode, the auto choke doesn't change the push, however when it advances to SPD mode it effectively deals with the airplane's velocity by changing motor push to match the chosen speed, albeit the plane's vertical speed expanded toward the focus on the plummet pace of 1,000 ft for each Minute wasn't quickly enough to keep up with or recover the legitimate floatway, causing the plane to float further above it. The help first official noticing from the leap seat reminded the team that they should keep 180 hitches until 5 m from the runway per the air traffic regulators prior guidance. The pilot observing recognized this update. However, the flight group actually hadn't decreased the air speed to 180 bunches. Right now the plane was flying too quick, making it harder for the team to oversee both elevation and speed. Actually at 1,120 for around 8.5 nautical miles from the runway, the pilot flying required the arrival stuff to be brought in, bringing down the arrival gear expanded drag, which decreased the plane's speed. Yet in spite of the extra drag, the plunge rate was still inadequate to recapture the ideal skim way the pilot flying could have moreover instructed folds 20 to increment drag further, yet he didn't. The plane stayed around 900 ft over the ideal coastway, and the responsibility was starting to develop for the flight team as they attempted to oversee velocity and height. The pilot checking took note the plane was situated higher than it ought to be comparative with the skimway. This appears to be a bit high. The pilot flying concurred, yet didn't make any prompt move. A couple of moments later, he requested explanation. Do you mean it's as well high? The primary official gave a muddled, not entirely settled to fix the circumstance. The pilot flying took activity aisle slide more. The upward speed was set to less 1,500 ft each moment, wanting to bring the plane in the groove again. For the following 21 seconds there was no correspondence between the flight group as the plane plunged through 2,600 ft at a drop pace of 1,500 ft each moment. However, even with this change, the airplane was still excessively high. Then abruptly the vertical speed was changed back to less 1,000 ft for every minute. This change was unseemly, since the plane was still fundamentally over the ideal coast way. The airplane expected to slip at a rate higher than 1,000 ft each moment to recapture the right plummet way. The flight group's inability to keep up with the higher plummet rate showed an absence of situational mindfulness in regards to their vertical position comparative with the float way. At 11:25, the regulator taught the flight team to contact the San Francisco and Airport Regulation Pinnacle. What's more, the pilot observing recognized the guidelines soon after. The pilot flying affirmed that the fog approach elevation was set to 3,000 ft, which would be utilized in case of a go-round. Minutes after the fact, the plane crossed the last waypoint, plunging through 2,250 ft to Part Harmony, situated around 5.4 nautical miles from the runway, had a base crossing elevation of 1,800 ft. Anyway, the plane was still around 450 ft higher than this, flagging that they were still excessively high for the move toward. The pilot flying confronted the challenge of diminishing velocity, while moreover presently plunging being excessively high made it significantly more testing to settle the methodology prior to coming to 500 ft over the ground level, a basic elevation at which the airplane should be appropriately adjusted and stable, balanced out for a protected landing. Folds 20. The folds were set to 20 as the plane plummeted through 1,900 ft. Not long after, the chose velocity was diminished to 150 to bunches, and the pilot flying mentioned another fold change. Folds speed. Really take a look at folds 30, so the plane's speed was still above 3,170 bunches, which is the greatest suitable speed for conveying folds 30. Subsequently, the folds couldn't be set to that position, yet conveying folds 30 would have diminished the plane's speed, with the airplane still flying too quick and too high. The runway was rapidly moving toward the pilot flying tempted to deal with the plane's Vertical profile acknowledging they required to lose elevation all the more rapidly. He exchanged the autopilot pitch mode once more. From vertical speed to flight level. Change speed without declaring the change as expected by the Tri-7. Working. Manual zeroed in on the velocity. The pilot checking didn't see the change once the velocity dropped. Under 170 bunches he promptly set the folds to 30 when flight level change speed mode was chosen. The autopilot answered by pitching the nose up to diminish the plane speed. The chose speed was 150 to bunches, yet the genuine velocity stayed at 170 to bunches. As the autopilot expanded the pitch, the velocity started to drop simultaneously. The chose height of 3000 ft set as the fog moved toward height was higher than the plane's ongoing height of about 1550 ft. Accordingly, the auto choke high level the push switches to start a climb, making a contention diminishing velocity by pitching up while adding push to climb. The pilot flying took prompt activity. Understanding this wasn't the planned result, he separated the autopilot by double tapping the wheel switch, which forestalled the oral caution from sounding. Taking manual control, he pulled the push switches back to sit. Furthermore, pushed the control section forward to stop the move by physically pulling the push switches back to sit. He unconsciously exchanged the auto choke to hold mode, which implied the auto choke was done. Changing the push to keep up with the chose air speed. With the motors now out of gear, the plane speed started to quickly diminish. Tragically, the team didn't understand that the auto choke was withdrawn, permitting the speed to drop uncontrolled. Speed target speed 137. At 11:26 the plane was around 2.9 mi from the runway when the pilot flying changed the chose velocity to 137 bunches. At the time, the plane's real velocity was still around 165 ties, with a drop pace of around 1000 ft each moment. At this point, the team ought to have had the option to see the POI lights, which would have shown for white lights, flagging that the plane was fundamentally over the right float. Way flight chief. Off. All right, ANA carriers had a casual practice of switching off the pilot flying's flight chief during visual approaches while leaving the pilot monitoring S on the right method. Anyway, required switching off both flight chiefs prior to reactivating the pilot monitoring S. For this situation, just the pilot flying S was deactivated. If both had been turned off, the auto choke would have changed back to SPD mode. Continuing program velocity control. This misstep might have forestalled the fast speed misfortune that followed as the plane dropped through 1000 ft at a velocity of 151 hitches. The PARI lights showed for whites, flagging the airplane was still as well high. Regardless of this, the plane's speed was hazardously low and the plummet rate was presently a lot quicker than required. Later, remaining over the coastway all through the drop, the airplane out of nowhere started to drop quickly, further compounding the temperamental move toward essentials. The group's consideration seemed partitioned, and the pilot flying center moved between attempting to keep up with the skim way and controlling the velocity, since the methodology was not balanced out at 500 ft over the ground level, a basic choice level by and large approaches. The flight group ought to have started a go around anyway. The pilots didn't notice that the boundaries surpassed the settled approach measures or accepted the deviations were minor and could be rectified in time. The plane's air speed started to dip under the reference speed of 130 to bunches, and the POI lights shown the airplane was dropping beneath the floatway with one white light and 3 red lights apparent. The pilot observing and help first official noticed the low velocity. However, there was no quick restorative activity. The pilot flying expanded the Planes pitched to ground for nose up yet. This was sufficiently not to capture the drop or recuperate the appropriate velocity. 200 as the plane dropped through 200 ft, the velocity had tumbled to 122. Tie hitches and the poi lights showed. For red lights demonstrating the airplane was presently essentially underneath the float, where the plane was quickly losing elevation and the velocity proceeded to drop, arriving at 114 bunches. The pilot, observing, got down on its low as the coastway and velocity were presently basically botched. As of now, the pilot flying experienced issues seeing the PARI lights. Regardless of these alerts and obvious signals, the flight team didn't start to circumvent this basic choice would have permitted them to cut short their rival endeavor and circle back for another approach. However, it was at that point beyond any good time to recuperate. The plane's speed had tumbled to 103 bunches, and the stick shaker, an admonition gadget that actuates when the airplane approaches a slowdown, started to vibrate. The control section, the pilot checking high level the push levels, endeavoring to add circumvent push the motors, answered, yet the plane's elevation was currently only 39 ft over the ground and the velocity was too low to even consider staying away from influence. The pilot flying pulled back on the control section, attempting to start a climb, yet with the airplane flying so low, keeping away from catastrophe was no more conceivable. At 11:27, the story of Asian A carrier's flight 214 struck the SEAW wall at the edge of the runway. The effect sheared off the tail area, shooting a few group from the airplane. The plane then turned round with the principal fuselage slipping along the runway prior to grinding to a halt. In the grass, crisis slides were sent and travelers raced to empty the plane. In the midst of the bedlam, the accident was caused principally by the flight group's fumble of the plane's speed and elevation. During the last methodology, the group neglected to screen key flight boundaries, including velocity and vertical profile, coming about in an unsound methodology. Notwithstanding different cautioning signs and obvious signals, the pilots didn't start a go-around. Therefore, the plane struck the SEAW wall just before the runway, prompting the crash. Inexplicable lie. 304 of the 307 individuals on board endure the accident. However, many experienced serious wounds. 3 travelers unfortunately lost their experiences. The examination featured the group's absence of involvement performing visual methodologies without the guide of the ILS skim inclined. The skippers restricted experience flying the Boeing Tri-7 and the breakdown in correspondence between the group.
The NTSB blames a lack of communication amongst the various fire departments and
security proposals were made, remembering upgrades for pilot preparing on manual flying abilities and approaches without ILS support. The mishap filled in as a sign of the basic significance of situational mindfulness, correspondence, and appropriate utilization of computerization.